Good morning, everybody. I think there might be a few more people filtering in, but we can kick off. Welcome to this IPPR event on Kickstarting the Plan for Growth. I'm Caris Roberts and I'm Executive Director here at the Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this event today. We'll be discussing the government's refreshed Plan for Growth, which replaced the 2017 era industrial strategy back in March. We'll be speaking with our contributors about that plan, what's changed, what hasn't, and what's needed as we recover from the pandemic to direct the economy towards social goals and towards stronger growth. With us today, we have a fantastic array of speakers. We have Lord Jim O'Neill, who is Chair at Chatham House and Vice Chair of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, and previously Commercial Secretary to the Treasury, Chair of the City Growth Commission, and lots of other relevant experience to this question. We also have Professor Diane Coyle, who is Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. She's also a Director of the Productivity Institute, a Fellow of the Office for National Statistics, and an expert advisor to the National Infrastructure Commission. We have with us Jürgen Meyer, who is Chair of Digital Catapult and Vice Chair of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. He served on the Industrial Strategy Council, advising the UK government on industrial strategy, and is former Chief Executive of Siemens UK. And then finally, we have with us George Dibb, who is head of the Centre for Economic Justice here at IPPR. Before joining us back towards the end of last year, George was head of industrial strategy and policy engagement at the UCL Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. So brings a great amount of expertise to this topic as well. In terms of how today will work, we're going to start with some comments from George, and then I'm going to ask each of our speakers to speak for a few minutes with any reflections that they have on the Plan for Growth and what we've heard from George. I'd then really like to bring in as many of you as we can. So please do be thinking of and storing up your questions, and you can put those in the Q&A so that I can come to them in the discussion afterwards. I think that's all that falls to me for now. So I'm going to hand over to George.
Yeah, thank you, Caris. And like Caris, I'd like to thank all the panelists and everyone for coming to this event and welcome you to the discussion on Kickstarting the Plan for Growth. This is the first event of what we anticipate to be many within the IPPR Recovery and Growth Programme, which is seeking to understand how the UK economy can bounce back and build back stronger from the COVID-19 pandemic. When I got up this morning, I was trying to work out what I would say in these remarks. And I think it was worth starting with an overall reflection on the Plan for Growth. And that is that whether it's called industrial strategy or not, industrial strategy is in fact here to stay. There's a widespread acceptance within UK policy that it's going to be impossible to achieve the government's stated ambitions to level up the regions of the UK or to achieve our decarbonisation and net zero ambitions without some form of structured engagement between government, policymakers, business and civil society. IPPR has long championed a greater role for the state in the coordination of the economy, from innovation to industrial policy and energy itself, thinking about big ideas about how the UK economy is structured. And I first came into this field through renewable energy policy, and I was reflecting on the changes that we've seen actually in the past 10 years and just how those big ideas can really shape the debate and the world and the economy that we live in. So when I first came into policy, I attended a speech by John Hayes, who was the energy minister at the time. And he spoke really eloquently, and this was eloquently about the role of the government is not to pick particular technologies or specific ways of development, is to set up a transparent and open framework within which the market can decide what energy mix the UK government will have. I think it's very clear that given that we now have a Prime Minister who will write a column in the Financial Times with how the UK is going to become the Dubai of offshore wind, specific plans and roadmaps for nuclear power, specific investments into battery electric car vehicle, that in those 10 years, the way we approach markets and the way we approach engagement between business and the state has really shifted by quite a lot. And IPPR has been at the forefront of that conversation too. In 2018, the IPPR's Landmark Commission on Economic Justice published its report and findings, which recommended a shift of the UK economy from its current model of consumption to one based more in being led by investment and innovation, with a strategy of green new industrialisation. We've also been supporters of a mission-oriented approach, which acknowledges that economic growth and innovation doesn't just have a rate, but also a direction, and that the state and policy has a role in shaping and maybe even creating markets which determine how the economy develops. All of these things are going to be absolutely critical as we try to develop a policy which helps the UK economy to bounce back from the past 18 months. But most importantly, IPPR also acknowledged that growth alone is not sufficient. We need to aim for prosperity, which understands that citizens' lives can't be measured by GDP and economic statistics alone, and that we need to think about economic justice and fairness, which ensure that more people and more places can share the rewards of that prosperity. So where is industrial strategy? There was a major step forward in 2017, under Theresa May and Greg Clark, the Industrial Strategy White Paper and the formation of, I hope you can still hear me, I've just seen a message in the chat, but maybe I had some disruption, but the 2017 Industrial Strategy has now been replaced by the Plan for Growth in March. There's some interesting ideas in there. You know, the move from BEIS to Treasury as lead department offers up some perhaps interesting opportunities for better delivery across government. And the acknowledgement within the document that not all types of growth are made equal is certainly an interesting acknowledgement from a Treasury document. But yesterday we saw a much reported publication from the BEIS Select Committee, which also criticised this Plan for Growth for being less transparent in its framework of how it engages with business, more stop and start policy from government, and also for a lack of clarity and direction. The government's spoken about how it wants to grasp new opportunities post-Brexit, opportunities for deregulation or re-regulation, a boost for investment, and a consideration of places. All of these things are going to require detailed policy consideration and engagement with stakeholders across the economy. These are important policies, and over the next 12 months, we're anticipating a series of strategies from different departments within that Plan for Growth umbrella. The innovation strategy is expected from BEIS next month, followed by a net zero and a heat strategy, for example. The IPPR Centre for Economic Justice and the Recovery and Growth Programme aims to be at the forefront of this debate, shaping and informing the conversation with independent research and by convening leading stakeholders like today's panel event. The CEJ seeks to be the foremost progressive voice shaping the economic policy debate in the UK, and we're grounded in academic economic research, but we have an in-depth understanding of the policy and political landscape. Our proposals are bold, propositional, and future-oriented, and we believe that that's the attitude that's needed to truly build back better from the COVID pandemic. It's an absolute pleasure to be on this panel with experts from across business, academia, and politics, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with the panelists and with all the attendees too. So thank you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks very much, George. So I'm going to turn now to our panelists for some opening remarks, and I'll start with Jim.
Thank you, Caris. Thank you, George. Very interesting. I'm going to presume you can hear me clearly, and you're nodding your head, so I'm going to proceed as though everyone can. Let me try to be brief and come at this from a slightly different angle than George, not least for the sake of not repeating things. And I'm there's sort of aspects of contradictory issues that I'll raise in my opening comments. And there's sort of three areas I want to cover. Firstly, just to state the obvious, it appears from a lot of the high frequency data that I've followed for the best part of 35 years, even though I'm not fully employed to follow it in the way that I obsessively did for a good 25 to 30 of them. It appears as though the cyclical economic recovery that is currently taking place is pretty staggering. You look at the latest PMI data, even though it's a bit softer than the month before, it's consistent with levels of activity that are pretty unheard of in the UK. And to some degree, it might not mean anything beyond the next few months, but it certainly means we're going to see GDP numbers printing that will also be unheard of for the next couple of quarters. And it will mean, whatever it does mean, that this sort of classic V-shape, at least in terms of economic data, that economists talk about so much, is going to happen, short of some imminent disaster. And with it, as always, there's going to be certain self-fulfilling, or not fulfilling, but certainly societal issues that rise from that, amongst of which government finances will continue to probably improve a lot quicker and better than has been generally expected. And as we keep repeatedly seeing, the unemployment picture is going to be nowhere near as bad as many people feared a year ago. Second thing to say, as sort of part of that, and is much more fundamental, and in this beautiful way that economics sort of sums up its both usefulness but also its own brilliance, is that it's not impossible in my view, and I find myself in saying it, it's slightly odd and not embarrassed, but it's sort of a little bit crazy, but it's not impossible that this pandemic and the scale of the societal shifts is actually forcing through some pretty fundamental changes that might actually help aspects of long-term economic change in the UK, but certainly without it, might not have happened. And at the core of that is of course productivity, which has essentially been the real Achilles heel of the UK for the past 20 years or so, as it's got progressively weaker and weaker. And many of the things we talk about, and IPPR is so brilliant at highlighting, including the report, Centre for Economic Justice report, they all, by and large, are a consequence of this weak productivity. And if you look at, just take two of the big things, the whole more flexible working environments in itself, to me, is an exceptionally healthy development that was supposed to have happened when I first started professional working in the 80s, and it's finally with us. And the other thing that can't be ignored in that regard is actually with what's going on in the housing market, which already before the crisis, we had this slightly peculiar thing going on from a historical perspective, that London house prices had started to go down, which historically would ordinarily signal an imminent collapse of house prices everywhere, and more importantly for the economy and management of policy, some kind of financial collapse. What's happened through COVID is that trend has been exacerbated further. And if this were to continue, and it obviously links partly to the level, to the flexible working thing and people choosing different kind of places and ways to live, this would do pretty inordinate things for at least wealth distribution in the UK, if not necessarily income distribution. Second big thing to say on top of that, and this is why I said at the start I'm going to be slightly contradictory and sort of say some odd things. Having been a minister in a Conservative government, albeit just for 17 months, that had involvement in writing one of these fancy reports about strategy, you know, they're easy things to write. And I'm not sure once they're written, any of them ever mean anything. And it's interesting to hear George talk about, and I know big fans of industrial strategy say this, about how useful the Theresa May approach on that was, but they weren't serious about it. It was just a report. And what is intriguing, all the things I just said as part of my first comment, are really happening irrelevant of the government that we have. And maybe it's another sign of the bizarre sort of fortunate aspects of issues to do with this particular prime minister, but he might be presiding over being the leader at a time where some things that might be very helpful to his agenda that he's actually not having anything to do with himself, if you see what I mean. And so you're getting various things potentially going on that are a lot more important for what he claims he wants to help deliver on than anything that they've said they're going to do. And I've put in there, from a 40,000 foot perspective, also issues to do with climate change. And then the last thing to say for now, however, and again, part of the contradiction, despite all of that, it seems to me we need things in addition or more than an industrial strategy. It's interesting being on the panel with Diane. She and I were at an event with the Chancellor a lot just before COVID, and I think we both shared aspects of this now. But it seems blatantly obvious to me that there's a need for a much more modern framework for both our monetary and fiscal strategy. I'm a big advocate of what I call nominal GDP targeting. We can see already that the big focus of concern amongst many, including in financial markets, is about actually inflation risk rather than immediately issues to do with growth, rightly or wrongly. And it's because the way policy has evolved in this country and others, the sort of narrowness of inflation targeting is sort of lost as a purpose. And we can and need to have more. And on fiscal policy, I would say the time has come, as evidenced by a government that has essentially thrown money around as though it's confetti, where we need to have a truly modern version of Gordon Brown's golden rule, in which investment spending and current spending are truly accounted for completely separately. And especially as it relates for what I'd describe as public goods, whether it be fighting climate change or something that I've been immersed in and remain immersed in for most of this year, aspects of dealing with this and future pandemics and other major global health threats like antimicrobial resistance. It's blatantly obvious that we need to be able to invest properly in the same way we have a defense expenditure to actually be positioned properly to deal with these things that we know that are out there. And then on top of that, there is all the stuff that, of course, probably why I was invited on this call that relates to the regional issues and levelling up. We need to be a lot more serious about devolution, which this government is not. And we need to somehow find a magic solution to breaking this persistent, almost post-war problem of being able to take some of our great ideas out of universities and turn them into not only world-beating companies, but ones that employ a lot of people with value-added jobs. And I'm not sure you need a piece of paper called an industrial strategy to do all of that. So I'll stop there and look forward to chatting about that, and as well as listening to the others now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, including for the challenge, coming to a think tank event and saying that we don't need more reports.
Well, I mean from the government.
Yes, yeah, I know. Thank you. I'll come now to Diane.
Thanks very much, and hello, everybody. There's already going to be an awful lot to talk about in those first two sets of remarks. Let me try and take a slightly different tack and talk about responding to the plan for growth, which is a list of really good ideas, but it's a real misnomer because it's not a plan. And the industrial strategy, you know, as Jim just said, it was a report and it had flaws, but it was a strategy, which was why I, at the time, welcomed it and am a bit disheartened now by the fact that it's been ditched and we have a new plan. It's marking season here, and I was just marking yesterday a paper by a student who had looked at UK industrial policy over recent decades, done a timeline, done a simplified structure of all the bodies that we have now from government engaged in what you might call industrial policies, and compared and contrasted that to a range of other countries, including the United States. And we are absolutely distinctive. The British disease is that we keep changing all the time, the policies with which we're getting government to engage with the private sector. You need two things from industrial policy. You need the policy to stay reasonably stable, and you need the actions of different bodies, public and private, national and local, to be reasonably well aligned with each other. And that's particularly important in these contexts where you're expecting the private sector to make very long-term investments in an uncertain environment. And whether that's about education of young people or investing in high-tech sectors or green transition, that's exactly the context that we're in now as we come out of the pandemic and think about achieving more evenly spread growth, achieving major transitions like dealing with antimicrobial resistance or green transition. There needs to be some stability. The fundamental role of government is to deliver a sufficiently stable framework for everybody else to make their decisions without adding to the risk. And we've got a government, and have had for many decades, that adds to the risk rather than mitigating the risk of the private sector. So this government's talking a really good game about levelling up, but on the whole, I'm still disheartened by what's been happening to policy. There are some big short-term challenges as we emerge from the pandemic. Jim just referred to the strength of the recovery, and that's absolutely the case in the aggregate figures. But we've got what some economists are calling a K-shaped recovery, and there are people who are not participating in that. One thing that particularly worries me is what's going to happen to the debts that are being incurred by smaller businesses and households, people who've not been able to pay their rent or their mortgage, small businesses that haven't been paying their rent or have maxed out on their credit cards to keep going. In 2018 figures, so well before the pandemic, 2/5 of households in the UK spent more than their income, and only half of those could fund that level of spending for more than a year. And there's a real age skew as well, so that applies much more to younger households who are setting out on their careers and have the prospect of their lifetime earnings and opportunities being scarred by the pandemic. So I think this is going to affect a significant number of households, and unless we get some resolution to this problem, which the government will have to be involved in, we're not going to have any growth for a big chunk of the population anyway. So all of those inequalities that we think already scar the economic landscape are going to get worse without that. And by the way, aggregate growth will be less than it could otherwise be. The long-term issues are really those ones that I just referred to about policy coordination. And there are good and bad things about the plan for growth in that respect. The good thing is that it's the Treasury, and the Treasury can coordinate across Whitehall in a way that individual departments don't. The bad thing about it is that it's the Treasury, and the Treasury has no intention of coordinating the local government. I think they see levelling up as something they're going to do to places. And that won't work, because you lose the information that you need to achieve the strategic coordination with the specifics of the jobs and the industries that exist in particular places. I completely agree with Jim about the need to rethink the fiscal policy framework. And it's clear already that traditional Treasury thinking about reducing the debt by reducing spending is kicking in, and not thinking about returns to capital investment, and that has to be done. But my final point is that if, because of Treasury thinking and the government, the Chancellor's wish to restore some kind of order to the public finances does kick in, and so the scale of investment that we need across the country in everything from health to public transport to R&D translation to schools is off the table, then it's all the more important to free devolved governments and local authorities to make their own decisions, to make the most of the assets that they have, because that's the only way that I can see us getting the stability of the policy environment that we need and the coordination that we need to deliver a relationship between the government and the private sector and the civic society that will actually make a difference, increase productivity, and improve people's living standards over time. So stop there, thanks.
Thank you very much, Diane, and some clear themes coming through already that we can return to in terms of devolution and fiscal rules. I'm going to turn now to Jürgen.
Yes, thank you very much, and also thank you for inviting me to speak at this this event. I'm one of those industrial strategy fanatics, I think is the word you use, Jim. So I'm definitely a strong supporter, and I agree with George. Whether it's called Plan for Growth, or it's called industrial strategy, or it's called innovation strategy, we have one. Because as a nation, we do invest, and we invest significant public resources in creating new sectors like the offshore wind sector that you talked about, George. Things like that don't happen by accident. Indeed, the way we were able to respond in the vaccines challenge didn't happen by accident. Some people think that that was just an agile, quick response, but actually, if you look at it in more detail, behind it was a lot of strategic investments in research programs, in pharma and vaccines, and in facilities such as catapults, that all then ended up playing a huge role in us being able to have a relatively good or a very good response to that vaccine challenge. So, you know, we have one and we need one. And therefore my argument is, well, look, if we're going to be investing public money in key strategic activities like being able to respond to pandemics and offshore wind, then why wouldn't you want to make it strategic? And why wouldn't you want to make and write it down in a plan that creates the sort of policy coordination that Diane was talking about? So I do agree with Jim when he says if it's a report that's just for the shelf, then save yourself writing it. But writing a policy, an industrial strategy policy document that does have the effect of coordinating activities, to me, is a good thing. And I actually think government underestimates its own ability to coordinate the market and activities within it. You know, from my observation of my time at Siemens is, you know, as soon as government says there's going to be a huge focus and investment in, for example, offshore wind, or it could be battery technology, it's amazing how much research programs, how much catapults, how much companies follow quite quickly. Of course, that gets diluted when then you U-turn from that very quickly, and then the next time around people might be a little bit more cautious. So again, I agree with Diane that the way to make reports not sit on the shelf is to give them strategy, to give them meaning, and as much as possible some longevity and some long-termism. The other point that I would just make is that where I also agree with Jim is that the pandemic, you know, is creating a shift in a direction at a speed that it wouldn't have done had we not had the pandemic. The shift towards net zero, for example, has got stronger as a result of the pandemic. And indeed, if you look at the drivers that have become more important, which is the need for net zero, which is the need to raise productivity, which is the need to create more industries that pay higher wages, which help raise prosperity, especially in levelling up regions. All of those are pointers towards needing more industrial activity. I found it interesting yesterday, some of you may have seen that there was a report coming out of the House of Commons Libraries that said that the UK is now the poorest nation in the northwest of Europe, if you measure it purely on GDP per capita. which isn't the only metric, but it's an interesting metric. And I strongly believe a key reason for that is because the UK has too much of a low wage economy. And that low wage economy especially exists in many of our levelling up regions. And if you compare that to many of the regions we're being compared to, they have a stronger industrial base, a stronger digital tech industries that I call frontier industries. And those invariably drive higher productivity, drive higher wages. So therefore, we do need to create more of those industries, and I can't see a better way of doing it than a strategy that pulls it all together. The other metric that says we need to do it is that we have an ambition to raise our R&D spend in the country from a very poor 1.7% of GDP up to 2.4%. And that 2.4%, we only become average. It's still way below what the USA, Germany, Japan, China, and other nations are doing. And there is no way that we can increase even to 2.4% if we don't increase our industrial activity, because it is industrial and manufacturing activities that spend 2/3 of national private sector research and development. So we have to have more industry and industrial activity if that is a serious aim of ours, to become a high research, high innovation nation. So finally, in terms of what do we need to do, well, I don't really care what we call it. I'm going to call it Plan for Growth, and within that, a very strong innovation strategy. What I think it needs focus. It needs focus for people to coordinate themselves behind, focus to ensure that we coordinate policies that include in their training and skilling of people for the industries that we decide to focus on. We need scale into those activities, and that's where very often we miss out in the UK. In fact, we often have the best in terms of excellence in areas like battery technology, hydrogen technology, but we then don't scale it into the industries of the future. And finally, we need, around those priorities and those scale priorities, much better policy coordination, and we need more long-termism and consistency to then implement those plans that gives companies and the private sector the confidence to really invest in those key industries.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. So we've got some really good questions coming through in the Q&A. Please do keep asking your questions there. I have tons myself, but I'm going to have to be disciplined in choosing them. I wondered if we could start by touching on the state of the economy as it is today. And Jim raised some really important things in his opening remarks about house prices and about productivity. And I want to ask you each something slightly different. Dan, I wondered if you agreed with Jim in terms of those factors that might be pushing up productivity as a result of the pandemic.
I don't think we know yet. The one that people have talked about most is the switch to working from home. And I'm probably on the skeptical end of how much this might be able to raise productivity, because in an economy where the value is added, whether it's an industry or services by the ideas, then the issue is all about how people exchange those ideas. And a lot of the drive towards activity congregating in cities, these agglomeration effects that economists talk about, have been the need for that sort of face-to-face contact about the kinds of things that you can't write down very easily. So I'm sure we'll end up with much more hybrid working than we have in the past, but I'm not sure what that's going to do to measure productivity. And I think that's still an open question. I do certainly agree that the pandemic has created the demand for things to be done differently, even if it hasn't induced the supply of things being done differently, if you see what I mean. There's a big appetite among the public in general, young people in particular, for a transition in the economy to something that is much greener and much fairer, and a kind of determination that we're not going to go back to the way things were. Back to normal is not what people want, not even building back better, but building something different. And I think if policymakers don't respond to that, then we're in for some quite unsettled times.
Thanks. And Jürgen, my question to you would be about businesses making decisions to invest right now. As you know, former chief exec of a major company, how would you be seeing that? What is going to be going through the minds of business leaders making those decisions currently?
Well, if we look at key industries of the future, which is electric vehicles, hydrogen economy, lots of aspects of the digital economy, like creating the 5G infrastructure of the future. If you're looking at those places, then there's sort of three things that as a investor, I think companies like Siemens would always look at. One is there excellence in research and innovation? And generally the UK, as I mentioned earlier, scores very highly. Secondly, are there skills available, and are there people that can come and work in those industries? And despite our criticisms of our skills system, actually the UK generally scores pretty well in that area. And then the third area is there real scale, ambition and long-termism to really make this industry happen? And on the latter, we generally score very badly. So if you just take the hydrogen economy, the UK, I think so far has put about public money of about 240 million into it. And if you look at economies like Japan and Germany, they're putting many billions into that same economy. So what tends to happen is companies sort of come and dabble in the UK because they want to be part of some of what's going on. But the scale of what they do ends up happening in other regions. And that's why I'm so strong on the point of scale. Of course, offshore wind is an exception to this, where we did put the scale into it, created the largest offshore wind market in the world. And hey, look what's happened in terms of the private sector investment following.
Thanks. And then, Jim, my question for you is on growth. And as you said, we're expecting very high rates of growth. And yet the Bank of England, unless I don't have the most recent report in front of me, does predict that or forecast that we're not going to hit that pre-pandemic growth path. Do you think the government is doing enough to ensure that the economy reaches its potential?
I just want to also start by answering this, reflecting on aspects of what Diane said. Even though I talked enthusiastically about the evidence of a V, when a lot of people talk about a K and not a V, I describe it more as a K inside a V. Because clearly with the scale of, and that's why I went, because what is the economy's potential in and post-pandemic? There's just so much huge structural change going on. As Diane also said, that the evidence is quite early on a lot of these things, notwithstanding what I said. But 3 or 4 other very quick things. So first of all, the Bank of England's forecast is a forecast. The bank has absolutely no great success as a forecaster over anybody else, and it has lagged, as most central banks do. When there's a sharp slowdown and a sharp recovery, they lag the evidence. So, no disrespect to anybody at the bank, a lot of them are my friends, but their ability to forecast the economy accurately is as suspect as anybody else's. B, is the government doing enough? I mean, it's chucking a lot of money at it, and one of the reasons, hopefully this will come up later, about education. I meant to say in my opening comments, it's very pleasing to see a lot of focus in the media in the past week on the scale of educational underperformance in places outside of London, particularly white working class boys, and we need a lot more attention on that. But again, as peculiarity of this very odd prime minister we've got, he's more expansionist by nature than many Labour leaders we've had in my lifetime, and he's not scared of trying to chuck a lot of money about. But the reason why the Treasury, I think, didn't support the very interesting ideas of Kevin Collins leading to his resignation in the education area is because we've got a spending review coming up with endless other departments demanding tens of billions too. And that is going to be hugely, to answer your, I go a long way to that answering your question. That is going to be way more than some report called an industrial strategy. The spending review is going to be the real sign of whether this government's got a proper strategy and what it is prioritising or not. And with it, what it might think about whether the potential for rate of growth might have changed or not. The bank has been the past 2 years very pessimistic about that, but even though it is premature, I personally see some signs out there of things for the better about the economy, and Diane touched on it towards the end about, particularly generationally, people want a different form of society. And I saw a couple of the questions in the chat about spending and investment and green and sort of a Gordon Brown golden rule. Yeah, of course we need. Within it, you need things where we can invest for proper social purpose. And in business, we need profit with purpose. And I think these are all things that are growing themes pre-pandemic. And this pandemic is accelerating them as the societal preference. And if a government wants to stay in power, it's got to respond to them.
Thanks. And then, George, my question for you would be, to what extent are we seeing a K-shaped recovery, and what relevance does that have to industrial strategy and how it should be designed?
I think the evidence on the shape of the recovery at the moment is a bit mixed. It's probably too early to say. What we do know for sure is that different people in different regions, different wealth levels, have had vastly different experiences of work and of their livelihoods through the pandemic. If you look at even thinking about working from home, which is something that we have taken for lots of people, at least in our sector, have taken for granted, comparing Richmond in London, where 75% of people were able to work from home, to Middlesbrough, where 14% of people were able to work from home, it's quite clear that the pandemic has affected different jobs and different communities in very different ways. Picking up the point around debt, which Diane raised, I think that continues to be a big concern in terms of the recovery and the differential aspects of that, given that the government rightly supported lots of firms in taking on debt to get them through the pandemic. It was remarkable the speed at which the Treasury worked to get that money out of the door. I think it was the right response at the time. And it probably would have been sufficient had the pandemic lasted for 6 months. But here we are a year and a half later, and the magnitude of the debt that some of those firms have taken on is quite spectacular. And I think there's a concern that different firms with different levels of cash reserves and different ability to bounce back will not be able to maybe invest in the kind of recovery or invest in their staff or make the productivity improving investments that we all hope to see coming out of the pandemic because of that level of balance sheet debt. So that's certainly a concern, and IPPR have recently published a piece of work on the need for potentially the state to step in and take some either debt restructuring, debt to equity swaps, or public equity stakes to support some of those firms. And similarly, I hope I'm not going to attribute a policy recommendation to someone who didn't say it. I think it was the FSB who recommended that some of those guaranteed loan debt could be transferred to employee ownership and giving people a stake in the recovery of the economy on a wider asset base, which I think is really interesting. The need for industrial strategy to address that, I think that is probably one of the central points. We know that different places and different people and different industries even will have different abilities to bounce back. The kind of coordination and the policies that need to be put in place to resolve those imbalances are what can be delivered. It's very hard to imagine levelling up, which is addressing a pre-pandemic problem, if in fact different places are already coming on a different growth trajectory coming out of this pandemic. And then just to look over the Atlantic as well in terms of what do we even think of as recovery. The UK is aiming to try and return to a previous level, a rate of growth, but not a level of growth or a level of GDP that we had pre-pandemic. Whereas in Washington, the debate is totally different. The stimulus that Biden has provided to the economy is projected to push the USA not just to its pre-pandemic rate of growth, but to a higher level of GDP than they would have otherwise achieved. And I think that's where the UK government should be looking to in terms of inspiration for the levels of investment that we would hope to see to actually provide that recovery.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to turn now to some questions from the audience. There's lots of questions coming in. There are a couple here that relate to levels of government and who should be making decisions. And I know that some of you mentioned this in your opening remarks. So we have one question, which is, will innovative thinking actually take place at the city level? And with a particular view to how to make our economy greener. And we also have a question from Mark Ambler here. Can the continued drive to raise productivity be delivered alongside levelling up without devolving more financial power to local authorities? Jim, I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that one.
Well, I said briefly in my opening comments about we need a lot more devolution. Three quick comments. I could spend all day talking about this. It seems pretty clear that this government is in favour of towns as opposed to cities for various reasons, but not least a lot of the city mayors are of a different political colour, which is a bit pathetic, but you know, there's some valid reasons for serious societal and society and genuine levelling up reasons for towns, but it should be both. And I think with it, they're not particularly enthusiastic about it. It's very disappointing, in my opinion. You know, going back to my now quite long role in this part of life, you know, it's no coincidence, in my view, that we are such an unequally geographic economy, and we have so much central power, particularly on skills. I mean, you know, it's 7 years now since I advocated the case for getting rid of any Department of Educational Biz, as it was called then, control on skills. It should be completely devolved. But there's not much sign of that happening with this government, other than throwing more money at it in general. I believe it. On education, we have a very Gove-esque framework still. Where it's all about academies and teachers, and there's no acknowledgement whatsoever, despite colossal evidence on the nature of a local educational challenge being deep rooted in the society and background of those communities, and that needs to change. And I think it's going to do in time. One of the dilemmas we're seeing with national politics, arguably even more evident in the Labour Party's challenges than the current government's, is that they don't get the scale of the sort of local revolution that's going on and the desire for more devolution. And I think we are going to get a lot more, but you know, this Westminster Whitehall bubble still exists, and people don't get it in Whitehall and Westminster still, but we need a lot more.
Thanks.
Can I
yeah, sure.
As well, it would be really wonderful if we could have a grown-up conversation about what kinds of decisions need to be made at what level of government. And some of those will be towns, some will be city regions. We've got a mess of different political decision-making frameworks and policymakers. We've got no clear lines of accountability and actually no really clear thinking about what needs to be decided where. And I would really like to see that happen, but completely agree with Jim, and actually particularly on skills, where there are centrally set curricula, and it's just not sufficiently granular. People sitting in London or wherever it is, wherever the central department is, just can't possibly know what skills are needed in different areas. And you know, it's not just that you need electricians, there are different types of electricians with different types of skills. And we've got an absolutely terrible educational framework in general, but particularly on that issue of coordination with employers and unions and civic organisations about what's needed in different parts of the country.
Thanks, Diane. Let's turn to that question of coordination. There's a question here from Kieran. Many agree any successful levelling up agenda would grow out of business, community and government working together. Yet despite all the papers and seminars, each all too often still work in its own silo. So how do we make joined up thinking and action the norm, not the exception? And then similarly, there's a question from Austin here, which is about the issue of public-private dialogue. So dialogue with the stakeholders in any plan for growth, firms and workers is surely one of the best ways of ensuring some continuity between sequential strategies, and is an essential way of ensuring the initiatives in the plan come into land with their intended beneficiaries. Didn't see evidence of consultations or dialogue in the plan for growth. Any comments? And Jürgen, I wonder if this is one for you to kick off with.
Yes, well, it's really very much what I said in my introduction. This is the whole reason for the strategy needing to be meaningful and to have real purpose, not one of the ones that ends up on a shelf. And that the strategy serves as the purpose to coalesce and bring all of those parties that in the questions are mentioned together. I mean, not wanting to be all negative, there is an opportunity, I think, that's coming up, and it's coming up very imminently, which is in the innovation strategy. And one of the elements of the innovation strategy is that we are hoping that there is going to be some innovation deals, and those deals will be very regionally focused. As the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, we're involved in supporting a number of those in Greater Manchester, in South Yorkshire, in the Northeast, and you can see what sort of clusters they could be around. In the Northeast, it's around EV and battery technology, in Greater Manchester around advanced materials, etc., etc. You know, and I think by creating those sorts of focus strategies, can you actually then get the players from, you know, national government in terms of the right policies, local government in terms of driving those with their local business community, and bringing the skill systems on board, etc., etc. You know, that's the way to do it. So I'm, you know, I must admit, I'm looking out very, very strongly for those deals in the innovation strategy, and hope they end up being scaled and purposeful enough to help create some of this coordination.
Thanks. Jim, was that you coming in there?
I hadn't asked. Yeah, I mean, these two questions are asking for the Holy Grail. I mean, of course you need everybody coordinating together, but it's easier said than done. Well, I'll throw in another thing, which I don't know why I'm sort of seeming slightly more optimistic about this than the others today, but you know, the one part of the levelling, you know, I obviously went into government completely related to Northern Powerhouse. And the thing I used to say to Osborne and Cameron all the time is, you guys should just keep banging on about it as much as you can. And because the signalling message of a central government can be, in my judgment, based on my own experience as a business financial person, is really important. Because if you just keep going on and on and on and on about something as a priority, and slowly it starts to be perceived by people, or quickly, as serious, the private sector will do some of these things for you. And so, as much as I share everybody else's general skepticism about what the hell levelling up still really means, the fact they keep going on and on and on and on about it means that there's a lot of people trying to explore parts of it. And in the spirit of the question, and something Jürgen knows quite a bit about, there's a quite interesting thing emerging based around some of the northern universities, which is going to be called Northern Gritstone, that I'm going to get involved in, which is essentially a sort of a completely private sector, private investor-driven thing, to start investing in spin-offs and start-offs from a number of northern universities. And I doubt that would have happened in a world where the phrase Northern Powerhouse and the phrase levelling up didn't happen. But it's not going to involve, other than hopefully a lot of supportive noises from government, it's not going to involve any money from government. In fact, that's the last thing I would have thought this entity would need. So, that's just one of many examples. But going back to what Jürgen said at the start, and I think Diane touched on, we definitely need a government that will help somehow crack almost this dilemma going on, from what I can see, the whole of my lifetime, never mind my adult lifetime, of how we can seemingly attract more patient capital to develop some of our great innovative ideas into proper productivity employing businesses in the UK, especially in some of these places that have had such a tough, multi-decade life.
Do you mind if I come in on that, Caris? I think I'd reflect that, where is this public-private dialogue going to happen? Where is the discussion between government and businesses going to happen? And I think probably picking up on both comments of Diane and Jim, that perhaps a good place for that to happen is at the local level or at the combined authority level, and to delegate quite a lot of those conversations away from Whitehall and away from having to speak to the Treasury to levels of local government, which are able to know more about the area in which they're based. But that does bring with it worries that at the moment we have this mess between combined authorities and LETs, which have very different abilities in terms of assessing those kind of those opportunities and the policy needed to address them. And it's a shame that what was a major part of the last industrial strategy, the development of local industrial strategies, seems to have no analogue within the plan for growth, at least that we've seen. I'd also reflect on the sector deals and the way that they were negotiated. Not that they were bad, but that the constraint put on who could approach government for a sector deal was quite constraining, in that the sectors had to have kind of centralised voice and centralised leadership, i.e. sectors that had quite a good trade association with an office in central London. And that's good for those sectors, and those sectors are important for the growth of the economy. But it means the more fragmented sectors which don't have that kind of centralised voice then couldn't speak to government about their needs. So I'm thinking about things like the hospitality industry or the retail industry, which are far more fragmented than, say, engineering or transport or even manufacturing, perhaps high-value manufacturing. And they're perhaps the areas that we want to address productivity uplifts if we're really thinking about this economy. So thinking about how businesses can approach government for that conversation. And then lastly, I do think when we're talking about public and private coming together to having that conversation, the government side has got to be able to provide a degree of long-termism, perhaps even over and above what businesses are able to provide for themselves. And perhaps this is controversial within the panelists or within the chat, but there were comments there about why did in the chat just then from one of the attendees about why is the UK a leader in wind power but not a leader in getting the benefits from that in the supply chain, in the manufacturing of components. Within the last 10 years, the UK government allowed the only wind turbine manufacturer based in the UK to go bankrupt. And yet 8 years on from that, the UK is now one of the leading countries in the world for wind turbine installation. That lack of long-term support and long-term thinking about how to join up, these are the aspirations for the direction in which our economy is going to go, and here is how we're going to support the companies who are going to be generating the jobs, and the return for the UK is the problem. And of long-termism, which I think probably all the panelists alluded to in their opening remarks, is part of the problem with this, is what this plan for growth will need if it's really going to deliver.
Thanks, George. I'm going to pivot now to a question I think it would be remiss of us to ignore, which is from Richard. And Richard says, Brexit hasn't been mentioned yet, so I'm dropping the B word, apologies. So Richard asked, do the speakers think it is a help or a hindrance to UK growth? I might adjust that slightly because we'll all have our different views on Brexit. I'd be interested to know in particular what you think the implications are for the industrial strategy going forward. And Jim, I see you've unmuted. Does that mean you're going to take this one?
I didn't do it. That was subconscious. I laughed. You know, it's not the most, from the starting place of Brexit in itself, all else being equal, which obviously it's not, and that's a really important part of my answer. It's not the most, you know, I describe myself as an objective Remainer. It's not the most important thing facing Britain's future. You know, the absolute worst of the independent estimates of what a no-deal Brexit would deliver the UK was something like an 11% negative GDP shock over 15 years from, I think it was the National Institute. The productivity on the shoe over the decade since the crisis is more than that. We need to sort our productivity problem out, which is linked to everything we've been talking about. Brexit in itself makes it probably worse, but because of what the Brexit issue has unveiled and the shock to the elite and the whole, you know, the whole levelling up agenda, if it ever were properly defined and implemented, that's exactly what the country needs. And it could have very different and complicated issues. Take the auto industry, for example, which essentially came here in the way it's done the past 30 years from what I can see, because because of our very cheap and flexible labour markets. And so all of that's got huge problems. But if we're going to deal with issues that have been around for 30, 40 or longer years in a much deeper way, then maybe we needed the shock of Brexit, which, you know, and of course, going back to it's not all else being equal, because we happen to have finally left when we've had another shock, which is of multitude times more dramatic, actually, we're not going to be able to tell for years. So I'm not sure. Obviously, it's a hugely important issue, but I think it's really impossible to assess any proper answer to it because it's very, very complex and there's all sorts of multiple things going off in tangents as a consequence, or in any case.
Which, of course, makes holding the government to account slightly harder.
Yeah, it's rather fortunate for them.
I'd like a brief comment, if I may, on that. I don't think there are examples of shock therapies that have gone well for economies. So I'm more negative than Jim. Actually, it makes the problems that we had even harder to overcome. And the one very, very clear bit of evidence from all of the work that economists have done on international trade is that geography matters, and a large market close to you is really important. So as the cliche goes, we are where we are, but I think it's going to be very important for a future government to negotiate better trading relationships with the EU.
Thanks. And Jürgen?
Yes, well, given I was a very strong Remainer, I think it'd be wrong of me not to comment. However, I always did say, look, you know, Britain outside of the EU will absolutely survive. It might not thrive quite as well, but it will survive, and we are where we are. It will not help us in terms of especially our exporting and our high productivity industries that we need more of. But where I see the contradiction is, you know, if I were now writing the policies, I would say, well, actually, this is the chance to now really switch our state aid, the amount of support we're going to give to research and development, and to use the one advantage we have created, which is that we have some independence in terms of those sorts of state aid policies, and to really significantly scale the sorts of industries that I was talking about earlier. So I really struggle to understand why, you know, given we've created ourselves a disadvantage, why we aren't now using the advantage we have much, much more in terms of supporting our industries that need the support in some of these key sectors.
I'd just add as well, one thing which the other panelists haven't mentioned is around regulation. A major part of the thinking about Brexit is that it would offer the UK opportunities to regulate differently outside the boundaries of the EU. And Boris Johnson set up this task force for innovation, growth and regulatory reform, which reported last month, led by George Freeman, Theresa Villiers and Ian Duncan Smith. And I'd say two things about that. One, it's quite stunning that they haven't come up with the big opportunity. Okay, they were sent off to find out this sector where the big regulatory reform would actually unlock major opportunities for the UK. And it comes back with hundreds of quite deep sectoral recommendations, but there is no single big win, which I think is important. And it's important because within the plan for growth, it sets out 3 different types of growth it wants to focus on: net zero growth, innovation growth, and global growth. And I think maybe this whole panel discussion is just us asking for further intelligent conversations down the line. But I think we need a really intelligent conversation about what are these global opportunities which we're targeting? Do they really exist? And how can the UK actually build on its advantages that we already know we have to achieve them? Because on the area of regulation, I feel like it was perhaps overpromised, and that opportunity isn't really there.
Thanks, George. I'm going to turn now to a question about fiscal rules. So Harry has asked, if we were to define a new golden rule, how would we define investment? And in particular, would social investment be included? And as well as commenting on that, I'd invite the panelists to also comment on where industrial strategy ends and where other policy starts. So should industrial strategy be including social infrastructure? What do we mean by that?
I'll take over from Karis. She frozen. Diana, were you unmuting to make a contribution?
I'm saying Karis's computer seems to have frozen, but I think this is one for Jim to start with.
Thanks. Well, my strongest example, response is to actually highlight something I'm in the middle of working for. I said at the start, and some of you know, I'm quite involved in a lot of issues to do with international health that have become bigger because of the pandemic. And I'm a member of the so-called Monti Commission, which was set up by the European arm of WHO. And one of our biggest proposals, which is relevant in the broader spirit of this question, or 2 of them that link to each other, is to push the idea of frame based on the style of the FSB, that was the Financial Stability Board, that was brought in post 2008 crisis under the G20, is to actually have a global health board under the G20, in that we stop having all these health entities, some remote, distant body that nobody else pays any attention to apart from as a global crisis, and bring it more integral into life, particularly involving finance. And I say that because the broader thing I think we ultimately need is a global public goods board under the G20, so that we help improve capitalism by having a direct purpose to try and minimize the externalities from the way the system has been, and to have it as an objective goal of reducing the scale of the problems related to things like climate change and like global pandemics and antimicrobial resistance, et cetera, and with it, going to the key part of this question, Diane spends a lot of time on this, and stuff that's been in the center of my previous life for 30 odd years. We have got levels of debt around many advanced economies that were supposed to be impossible for us to live with. And and we have, by the way, close to, despite the backup in bond yields, the lowest bond yields we've seen in my adult life. And so it's pretty minute-to-minute evidence is that a lot of what was in the textbooks, for whatever reason, might not be true. And yet we have all these societal needs. And going to the core of Harry's question, you can't solve big societal challenges without a very big patient investor that might have to do it on less remunerative financial returns than the truly profit-only motivated private sector. So you need more investments with big multipliers for society. The current framework that the IMF sits on top of for the whole of its membership around the world thinks about the framework, and it's almost embarrassing. You know, it's sort of ridiculous. It's just out of date, and that's without even delving into the emerging world and the likes of in India, where, you know, many developing countries spend hardly anything on education and health, and it's partly because of the framework of the internationally accepted fiscal rules. And we need to get rid of this nonsense and have a proper separate budgeting process for investments and consumption. And it's not going to happen tomorrow, because I'm recommending a very sizable shift, but we need it here, and we need it all over the world. And it's kind of embarrassing that we live in a supposedly sophisticated awareness life of 24/7 information about anything, and we think in such an archaic, narrow framework about fiscal policy. It's madness.
I wholeheartedly agree, and would just want to add, picking up the point about social infrastructure, the issue is whether the government's spending money, investing money in things that will deliver a long-term return over the future. And there's no reason to think that's only concrete. In fact, it's madness when we've got an economy where most of the value in our biggest and best companies is intangible. Why we would not be including investing in education and health is absolutely beyond me. So I'm completely in favour of thinking carefully about what social infrastructure we need, what intangible infrastructure we need, and including that in the calculation.
Yeah, I would strongly agree with Jim and Dan, who put it far better than I could. The only thing I would add is to think about whether our models of how we assess investments within Whitehall and within the Treasury are up to scratch as well. If, just looking at the pandemic, it seems like the Treasury blocked greater investment in sick pay, which may have potentially caused a second wave of the pandemic. We need to think about how we actually justify investment into social infrastructure, because it would appear that our frameworks of cost-benefit analysis aren't up to scratch because we're not making the investments that we need to. And also, I find myself again looking over the other side of the pond here, that a kind of core plank of Bidenomics seems to be treating social infrastructure, and in particular social care, as a vital part of infrastructure that needs to be invested in. And that is foreseen to drive a kind of a labour market, a tighter labour market, which also enables uplifts in pay and in conditions, which are absolutely essential here in the UK too. So I think there's inspiration to take from the example of the USA.
Thanks. Jürgen, did you want to come in, or should we
No, I was just violently nodding with everything that all three speakers have just said, so totally in agreement. Yeah, I mean, given what's happening in the USA, what George was just commenting about, it does seem an opportunity for the UK, given our strong relationship with the USA, to take a much stronger leadership. We talk about global Britain and more influence now, and that would seem to me to be a very positive thing for Britain to be doing, to really be standing up for rewriting some of these fiscal rules, as Jim says. And historically, taking the USA with us would have been impossible, but with the Biden administration, there could be an opportunity for partnership there. So yeah, very much in agreement.
Great. And I mean, Biden has used the phrase build back better, as has Johnson. There's a question here from an anonymous attendee of, do we really think people want things to be built back differently? I can see people who before COVID believed we should have an industrial strategy saying because of COVID, we should have an industrial strategy, as with other kind of areas of policy. But has there really been a shift in opinion with those opposed to such things now convinced they need one? I don't know if anyone wants to answer that.
I mean, I'm happy to go first on that, and to say glass half full. I think there is a shifting mood, and people do want to build back better, both people in society, people in business, and people in politics. The issue is one of adjusting our policies, and we were just talking about financial frameworks to really support that happening, and that isn't happening fast enough yet. But I certainly think that now is the time to take any new policy that is put in, whether it's on tax incentives, whether it's on industrial strategy, to always see it through the lens of building back greener, so building back in a more sustainable way, and ensuring that whatever is built back really does tick the box of creating societal value. So I think the intent is there, but now to really show that we mean business needs to happen at a faster pace.
I think there's a really big generational shift. So the younger generations have a very different view of many of these issues. And I think the mood is really shifting at local level as well, where there's a real determination to do what it takes to build local communities.
That's good to hear. In terms of what I might kind of ask, because there's another question here about government and the what's described as short-termist criteria in the Levelling Up Fund and the Community Renewal Fund. And I guess my question really is about government's responsiveness to different people's demands. So if younger generations do want to see things built back differently, what are the pressures on this government to do so? And do you think, kind of relatedly, that the things that they have announced around levelling up are actually strategic choices, or are they in fact responding to particular groups of voters? Jim, would you like to take that one?
I'm laughing at that one. So it seems to me pretty clear the government's responding the way it designs these things. It's responding to its actual and its perceived political base, plain and simple. As we saw within 24 hours of the public announcement of the Towns Fund, for a place like Richmond in North Yorkshire to be a more obvious beneficiary than some of the coastal places that weren't on it doesn't suggest there's a lot of thought going into it. It's a very vivid illustration of this government, as we see in the matter of the weekend, that the government has a very, very peculiar approach to how it decides its policies, and they seem to be highly focused on the red wall seats and as well as trying to adapt and retain its older voting base. And we'll see more of it in coming months in the whole debate about the triple lock and pensioners. What is interesting, and I was thinking about it as Jürgen and Diane answered the previous question, that it is striking and it's beautiful about how the younger generation is so interested in things with much broader values. I see it in my own two kids, and I see it every time I come across somebody from a younger generation than me. And that's going to be a problem for this government at some stage as we go through time, unless the normal passage of life, and that as people get older, they get more conservative. But it seems to me the government is going to have to take, it goes back to what I touched on earlier, that if this is a genuinely significant societal shift, and I suspect it is, then a government that wants to be in power has got to respond. And I think this is a really healthy development. And I think it might have crept into slightly older generations because of what's gone on with the pandemic, because it's opened all of our eyes about things that we can experience in a way that we weren't forced to even think about before the pandemic. So, it's going to be amusing and interesting to watch and see how this odd government tries to navigate that. But it's very encouraging, in my opinion, for the longer term.
Thanks. Would any of the other panelists like to touch on it? George?
Just quickly, I would add to the triple lock on pensions that Jim raised, also home ownership and things like planning reform as really important kind of drivers which affects something that Diane raised earlier, which is around intergenerational fairness. This is something IPPR has touched on a little. Others also think about it. I mean, other think tanks are available. And I think that thinking about political pressures on the government, it's pretty clear that they're looking at these by-elections in Hartlepool and Cheshire and Amersham. It's clear they're trying to make a political majority around older homeowners. And I think that has quite worrying implications if then the support for those groups of people in those constituencies starts to break a kind of model of social mobility which allows other people to climb on that ladder. If supporting homeowners and planning reform means that we don't build more houses and ease other people, younger people getting onto the housing ladder, then it creates worrying trends in our economic justice. And I think that's a real challenge for the government coming up.
Thank you. I'd like to offer each of our panelists now just a chance to offer some closing remarks on the discussion we've had. We've covered a huge array of topics, from fiscal rules to productivity to social infrastructure, Brexit. So there's a lot to think about there, but do you have any key takeaways that you'd like to reflect on? And I think I'll start with Jürgen, if that's all right.
Well, I'll keep it very brief and say that, the discussion has highlighted again how important it is that we need more industrial activity, especially in our levelling up regions. We need them because they drive productivity, they drive sustainable industries of the future. They create lots of high wage jobs, which we need more of. So, it would seem bizarre to me if, especially in an after Brexit world, we don't take the opportunities to scale and invest much more significantly in some of our core industries of the future, such as hydrogen, more offshore wind. There was a comment in the chat about, yes, it's been hailed as a success, but there's a lot more to do. Tidal energy, all sorts of amazing opportunities to create great industries, great jobs, great communities, and I'd love to see local, national government and business getting behind these a lot more, and to do it well, written and a coherent industrial strategy is surely a good thing to have.
Thanks. Jim?
Well, thanks very much for including me. I'd say two things. Just one important thing in terms of the beginning of change. I'm responding to something that I think George said, that the government has made an important change with the so-called Green Book for the approval of investment procedures, which hasn't got a lot of attention, but I think it's important, in which they're essentially going to make it easier to approve of projects to help levelling up. And I know, because I've talked to key drivers of it, and I was campaigning for it for years, but one of the early places to choose is Stoke. And it's going to allow them to look more seriously at certainly physical investment than before in such places. But I raised that because it links to my second point, but just to finish the first one. In the spirit of Harry's question and how all of us answered it, something like that needs, through time, to start considering non-physical infrastructures too, in order to make a true difference. And which takes me to my second point. We've touched on it, but not talked about it much. And the educational challenges in our country are seemingly, incredible. And out of everything that could be part of levelling up, in my judgments, the ultimate thing which is really important for a policymaker to focus on is education at the primary and secondary school level, because if we don't sort that out, the rest is just a waste of time. And there was big enough disadvantages before the pandemic, and the pandemic has obviously really exposed and broadened them further. And I wish, despite what happened over Kevin Collins, that by the autumn in the spending review that I'd wake up. It's not likely to happen, but I wish it did. It would be fantastic if we started to have spending on disadvantaged educational opportunity as part of the Green Book approach, because we really need to have a much more deep-seated approach to these places that have got multi-generational educational challenges.
Thanks, Jim. Diane.
Thanks very much. It's been a great conversation. So just very briefly, since around 2008, real wages for the typical person in this country have been falling. And that's something that hadn't happened since the dawn of capitalism. And then we had the pandemic. And so the conclusion I take from all this is that there's both the appetite and the opportunity to build a more productive country where everybody can prosper and have a chance to get on in life or have opportunities that they want. But it's also a time when we face really big challenges and expectations have been raised very high. So I don't know whether that makes me optimistic or pessimistic, but it's going to be a really interesting few years ahead.
Thanks, Diane. And George.
Two very quick thoughts. One would be actually thinking back to Jim's comments at the beginning about the shifts we've seen during the pandemic, of how we need to think about innovation slightly differently. It's not just synonymous with research and development, it's synonymous with wider shifts in our economy, business models, modes of operation. Think about how restaurants managed to kind of reorient themselves to kind of selling meal kits online, the incredible dynamism within the economy. And if we can coordinate some of that for betterment of society, it would be absolutely incredible. The second is just how broad this conversation has been and the incredible number of things we've touched on. It's absolutely clear that we're not going to get to the bottom of this in 90 minutes. We're not going to get to the bottom of it in 6 months. This is going to be an ongoing effort, and the government is going to continue to develop ideas in the space. One of the speakers in the Q&A said, thanks to all the panelists, wish they were the government. That's not what I'm aiming for, but I'm absolutely very keen for us to continue this discussion. With Diane, Jim and Jürgen and with others, and to continue to try to inform this really important policy programme, because I think it's absolutely clear from the conversation today that there is an incredible opportunity here if we can get it right.
Thanks, George. So it just falls to me to say thank you very much to all of our attendees for coming along today and for asking really insightful and thoughtful questions. And a huge thanks to our speakers. We're very lucky to have such an expert group to discuss this, as we're very, very grateful for your time. Please do follow IPPR on Twitter or follow our newsletter to keep up with the Recovery and Growth Programme that George outlined at the beginning. We've also got lots of other work that is very relevant to this debate. So in a couple of weeks, we'll be launching the final report of our Environmental Justice Commission, which looks at how we can have a fair transition across the country as we transition to net zero and the restoration of nature. We're doing some work on education and the purpose of education with partners across the education sector. So please do follow and keep up with that. And of course, IPPR North has really been at the forefront of these debates for years in terms of how to benefit areas across the country. So please do follow each of those strands of work. But for now, a huge thank you, and I hope you have a great day.